Welcome back to part 2 of my 2-part series all about getting paid to play the game of baseball. In this video, I'm going to talk about the rise of free agency in the 1970s and what that's done to the baseball players' salaries over the last 50 years. Come with me and let's check it out. Hey everybody. Thanks for joining me on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. Today's video is a continuation of a video I put out last week, which was part 1 of getting paid to play baseball for a living. If you haven't checked that video out, I do recommend starting with that one first and then coming back to check this one out. Today's video picks it up around 1970, and we're going to talk about the rise of free agency. At the end of part 1, I started talking about how some guys started to team up together, like Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax, to negotiate with their teams and try to get a little bit more leverage. And then the formation of the Union of Baseball Players in the late 1960s. I ended with the story of Curt Flood and how he took it upon himself to actually protest being traded and refusing to go to his new team to play without being able to negotiate a new salary. I went over how his case actually went to the Supreme Court where he lost, but his actions in having that case opened the door for what's to come in the 1970s. Free agency still took a few years, but there were some key wins that came along with Marvin Miller at the helm of the Baseball Players Union. Before we get started, take 1 second. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this video with anybody you think would like it. And with that, let's get to it. In the early 1970s, the Union of Baseball Players won the right to have their grievances heard by an independent third-party arbitrator, rather than the commissioner, who was the previous person to hear any grievances. And as we all know, the commissioner works for the owners of the teams. By the mid-1970s, the players won arbitration, a system in which they could actually go in front of an arbitrator every year and argue that they should be paid a higher salary than they were getting. In 1975, Catfish Hunter was granted free agency because the owner of the Oakland A's, Charlie Finley, went back on the contract that they had signed together. Catfish was made a free agent and was free to negotiate with any team of his choosing. A new owner at the time, George Steinbrenner of the New York Yankees, swooped in and paid Catfish Hunter handsomely to be a Yankee. Way more money than any player had seen before, and a multi-year contract. By 1976, all the players in the league had won the right for free agency because of the Seitz decision. What led to the Seitz decision is that 2 players, Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith, actually played the 1975 season without signing a contract. Since they had no contract, there was no reserve clause to be tied to them, and an independent arbitrator granted them free agency. Finally, the players could see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you didn't sign a new contract, you could be granted free agency. And before long, the owners had lost the battle. The economics of being a baseball player had finally caught up to the last 100 years of American culture in a very short decade. Soon after the Seitz decision, the owners and the players signed a new agreement that would allow free agency to happen after a certain number of years. The way the system was set up from that agreement is that a player plays for his team in the minor leagues as he's developing and getting ready for Major League Baseball. Once he graduates to Major League Baseball, he is tied to his team for the amount that his team wants to pay him for years 1, 2, and 3. Now, there were minimum salaries set during this time as well, and we'll get into minimum salaries a little bit more in a few minutes. In years 4 to 6 of a Major League player's career, he has the ability to go through the arbitration process, where he goes up against his team in front of an arbitrator to argue how much he should be paid versus how much the team thinks he should be paid. The good thing about arbitration is that any wins sets a precedent for the next guy in line ready to argue his case. And then finally, after year 6 in the major leagues, every player is granted free agency to be able to go negotiate with any team of his liking. Now, this new agreement resulted in a number of players that had all served more than 6 years becoming free agents all at the same time. Sports agents became a thing for the first time in that year. The owner's initial reaction was to band together. If none of the other owners would offer these new free agent players their high salaries, then they'd have to come crawling back to their teams to play for another year. This was a great idea from the owners at first. However, it only takes one owner to upset the whole cart, doesn't it? Within hours of the start of free agency, several owners had broken the ranks already because they wanted to win and they wanted to pay some players to bring in those names to their cities. The owners that broke the ranks were the relatively new guys around the block, not the old-time traditionalists. Owners like George Steinbrenner of the Yankees, Ted Turner of the Braves, Ray Kroc of the San Diego Padres, and Gene Autry of the California Angels. They started spending money left, right, and center to lure free agents to their teams. And suddenly players were rolling in more money than they could have dreamed of having in their careers. Several teams decided to stay out of free agency completely. They refused to participate. Over the next few years, baseball salaries started to spiral out of control, and the teams that were sitting on the sidelines had no choice eventually but to jump in at some point. The average salary for a baseball player jumped from $45,000 in 1975 to about $145,000 by 1980. And many of these were not great contracts. For every Reggie Jackson that ended up being a great signing, there was a 35-year-old veteran shortstop or a 38-year-old relief pitcher that wouldn't even finish out playing his contract, but would still need to get paid. The problem was the players had finally won free agency, and the owners had done nothing to prepare for it. They ignored the problem, expecting it would never happen to them, and when it did happen, they didn't know what to do. They were falling all over themselves to try to figure out how to keep salaries down or get them back down. And once again, they took the tact of putting out in the media that these ball players were just greedy and didn't love the game of baseball like the fans do. And once again, many of the fans sided against the players who were just simply finally getting their share of the pie. By 1980, the owners and the players were sitting down again to sign a new labor contract. And the owners had an idea. They wanted to tie compensation to free agency, meaning that any free agent that actually signed with a new team in a given year, his new team would have to send a player back to his old team. Marvin Miller, still the head of the union at that time, absolutely flat out refused. He made sure the players understood that any compensation tied to free agency was not really free agency at all. Miller insisted the players could not agree to this because it would set them right back where they started. The players were willing to stand up for themselves too. As they saw it, after 100 years of being at the mercy of the baseball owners after the institution of the reserve clause, they wanted to maintain the rights that had recently been given to them. The baseball union stuck together again like glue. And on June 12, 1981, the players went on strike when a new labor agreement could not be reached. The players and owners battled it out over the next 50 days. But in the end, it was once again the baseball players that showed their resolve and the owners that crumbled under the pressure because of all the profits they were losing with no baseball games being played. They finally signed an agreement that was actually a pretty fair compromise, and they went back to playing baseball games in August of the same year, missing just 2 months of the 1981 season. The result of all that, though, was an even further split within the ownership group. Guys like George Steinbrenner and Ted Turner continued to spend money freely, whereas many other owners still flat out refused to spend money on free agents. Teams like the Cincinnati Reds just did not want to participate in it. The average major league salary again increased from about $145,000 per year in 1980 to $371,000 per year in 1985. The owners were crying that with all the free agent contracts that they were handing out, they were losing money hand over fist. The owners decided to shake things up. They fired their old commissioner and brought in a new one who would be much more hard-lined and in their favor. His name was Peter Ueberroth. Ueberroth's first order of business was to compile all the information from recent free agent signings in the last 10 years to show the value that those players contributed against the money being paid to them. He put it right in the owners' faces, all the money that was being spent on players that weren't even in the game of baseball anymore. To their faces, Ueberroth called the owners dumb for being willing to sign these free agent players simply to win a World Series. Without saying it explicitly, and with lawyers there to watch, the order was still pretty clear. I imagine they were all sitting around a table in a dark room with cigar smoke hovering everywhere. Maybe Ueberroth had a cat on his lap that he was petting as he was laughing maniacally.
Who gets angry, Mr. Bigglesworth gets upset.
But the order was pretty clear. Everyone stop signing free agents and stop now. The off-seasons leading up to 1985, 86, and 87 put all the writing on the wall. Really great players from that time could not even sniff a contract. Guys like Kirk Gibson, Phil Niekro, Jack Morris, Carlton Fisk, Tim Raines, Paul Molitor didn't even get a single contract offer. Andre Dawson wanted desperately to be out of Montreal, but the only way he could get a different contract was as a walk-on in spring training with the Chicago Cubs. He just showed up one day with no contract in hand and said, "I'm not leaving until I get one." Of course, with all the publicity of Andre Dawson suddenly showing up at your facility, the fans wanted you to sign him, and the Chicago Cubs really had very little that they could do about it. Now imagine, this is a future Hall of Famer in the prime of his career, walking into a facility and begging to be signed to a contract. You wouldn't think it would be that hard. But under these current conditions, with the owners colluding together not to sign any free agents, the Chicago Cubs' hands were tied. The average Major League salary actually declined for these 3 years in a row. And just like the throwing of the 1919 World Series, it was way too obvious. The union wasted little time to file grievances for collusion against the owners. They filed 3 separate grievances, one for each of the off-seasons in question, and they eventually won an award of $280 million to be split up among those free agents. And not only that, anybody that was a free agent during those 3 years was made a free agent over again to sign a contract with whoever they wanted. And for Dodger fans, this ruling is what brought Kirk Gibson and the World Series trophy to Dodger Nation in 1988, and finally convinced some of the owners at least that free agent signings could be well worth the money. The reality during this time period is that the popularity and in turn the earnings within the industry of baseball were actually going up steadily since the advent of free agency. The owners were making more money than they ever had. The owners had continued to ignore television for the most part until the mid-1980s, but now they were also rolling in TV money since signing their latest contracts. But it didn't stop many of the owners from still crying foul. They had had control over the players for 100 years before, and they still did not like a system where they lost that control. Even after the collusion of 1985 to 1987, the owners were still looking for a way to keep salaries down in the early 1990s. The next idea that they had to throw around was the salary cap. They wanted to put a cap on how much each team could spend on players, effectively limiting salaries in the long run. The players once again wouldn't have it. They saw any free agency with strings attached as not good enough for them. After 100 years of the reserve clause keeping salaries down, and within the only 15 years of free agency, the owners already participating in collusion, the players were not ready to put any trust in the owners. They tasted freedom for the first time to make what they wanted and negotiate with whoever they wanted, and they would not give it up without a fight. There was a lot of bad blood and mistrust, not only between the players and the owners, but even between the negotiators between the two sides. The next labor agreement was set to expire at the end of 1993. Negotiations kept going, and the 1994 season was actually started without an agreement in place. They continued negotiating all the way into July of 1994, but in that month, the owners decided to withhold a payment to the pension plan for the players that was part of the previous agreement. The players responded to this action by setting a strike date of August 12, 1994. When that day came and went and there was still no agreement in place, the players once again went on strike. Negotiations continued for the next month, but when no advancements were made by September 14th, the commissioner of baseball at that time, Bud Selig, called off the rest of the season. For the first time since 1904, there would be no World Series. Because of the mistrust between the two sides, the negotiations slogged on through the fall of 1994 and into 1995. By January of 95, Congress had intervened, and even President Bill Clinton issued an order that the two sides had to agree by February 6, 1995. This date came and went without an agreement, showing that even a mandate by the President of the United States could not get the two sides together to come to an agreement. Heels were dug in on both sides, and the owners somehow decided that the best course of action for them was to invite replacement players to spring training in place of the major league players. With replacement players attending spring training, the players' union openly stated that they would not return to baseball if the season was started with replacement players. The idea of replacement players was just bad baseball. Essentially, lesser players that were crossing the picket line to play the game in place of the high-caliber players we were used to. Sparky Anderson, the manager of the Detroit Tigers, was placed on involuntary leave of absence because he refused to coach replacement players. The Baltimore Orioles were the only team that actually chose to sit out the season rather than employ replacement players. With only days until the season was set to begin, Judge Sonia Sotomayor, the eventual Supreme Court justice, issued an injunction against the owners in response to the players' complaint about unfair labor practices. And the decision was upheld during an appeal by the owners as well. The players voted to return to action based on this decision. And the 1995 season was finally started a little bit late, but under the previous labor agreement, which was extended until a new one could be agreed upon. The owners had no choice and no legal standing but to acquiesce and let the players come back and play the 1995 season. Both the 1995 and 96 seasons were actually played without an agreement in place. When an agreement was finally made in November of 96, the owners had given up on their ideas of either changing the arbitration system or instituting a salary cap. What they came up with instead was the introduction of an idea called a luxury tax, and it eventually became revenue sharing. Any team that had a payroll over a certain threshold would pay a tax on that overage into a pot, and the pot would then be redistributed to the smaller market teams that had a bit more trouble maybe of attracting free agents or being able to pay them. The fallout of the 1994 strike and the 95 replacement player situation meant that baseball took another hit in popularity. After its rise throughout the 80s and into the early 90s, fans flocked away from the game in droves. Once again, the owners took the opportunity during the strike and Lost World Series to paint the players as greedy and ungrateful once again. The owners were crying that they were losing money, especially having to pay these free agents all of the salary now. But in reality, there was another facet that wasn't being paid much attention to at the time. And that was the privilege of owning a baseball team, which continued to increase in value every year that went by. For example, in 1970, before the advent of free agency, the average major league team was worth about $10 million. By 1994, the year of the strike, the average major league team was valued at $111 million. Quite the increase over a 24-year period. Another example, maybe a bit extreme, but it shows the value of baseball teams. George Steinbrenner paid about $8.3 million for the New York Yankees in 1973. The valuation of the Yankees in 2021, $5.25 billion. Even if the teams are losing a little bit of money every year, if they're not being very competitive, the owners are still making up for it, and then some, just by the increase in the valuation of the teams each year. After the end of the strike, baseball struggled in the mid-90s. That is until the 1998 season. And what brought baseball back to popularity was the home run chase between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. The home run chase was fueled by what we now call the steroid era. But at that time, it was just exciting baseball, and everybody was jumping back on the baseball bandwagon to watch this historic home run chase. I'm not going to get into the steroid era. I will be happy to do that in other videos. It's not the subject of this one. But I will quickly say this. The owners and the people who run baseball were more than happy to throw the players under the bus once again after the steroid era. There are a few key players in that time in baseball history that are the face of steroid use. And everyone else involved, from team managers to general managers to owners and even the commissioner of baseball, has seemed to have gotten a free pass from the stains of that era. I say this way too often in these videos, but once again here, the players took the brunt of the backlash that really was a widespread problem throughout the institution of baseball. By the next labor agreement that was actually due pretty quickly again in the late 1990s, the owners had planned ahead. They had decided once and for all that free agency was here to stay, and they expanded upon the revenue sharing program to tweak it a little bit more, make it more competitive, and baseball a more even playing field. In the early 2000s, this was a big problem because a lot of the biggest market teams were the ones that were over and over again signing the best free agents for the most money. Other small market teams couldn't compete, and baseball was really worried about competitiveness in the game. Baseball teams started sharing things like merchandise and local TV revenue so that everybody had a little bit more of the pot. They were starting to realize that baseball was actually a healthier industry if all the teams could be competitive, rather than just a few year in and year out. The early 2000s also brought a huge change to free agency because of the sheer money and length of contracts that were starting to be signed. In 2002, Alex Rodriguez broke all the previous records by signing a 10-year, $250 million contract with the Texas Rangers. Players were signing bigger and longer contracts, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots was widening every year. Small market teams, just like the Oakland Athletics, had to come up with different ways to be able to compete with teams like the Yankees and Red Sox and Dodgers. And Billy Beane was the perfect guy to start this revolution. Now, Moneyball, for those who haven't seen it, it is a great movie and you should go out and check it out. It has Brad Pitt portraying the lead character, Billy Beane, trying to figure out how to compete with this small market team against the Yankees, especially that year, with a shoestring budget, employing low-paid rookies and past-their-prime veterans. Now, even though it's a great movie, it does sometimes miss the point. And the point of Moneyball is really finding value in players, skills in players that are undervalued by all the other teams in the league. If Billy Beane can get an advantage by employing these types of players that are underpaid by other teams, maybe he can compete on their field of play with still a small budget. Many teams scoffed at this strategy for many years to come, but some of the teams started to see what kind of value could come out of this way of thinking. The Boston Red Sox were one of those teams. They tried to pry Billy Beane away from the Oakland A's in 2002, but he refused. So what Boston did, they went out and hired a recent Ivy League graduate, Theo Epstein, who had never run a Major League Baseball team before. Now, all Theo Epstein did was put together a Boston Red Sox team that finally won the World Series in 2004, breaking an 86-year-old drought of World Series titles for that team. And not only that, he moved on to the Chicago Cubs eventually and put together a team that won the 2016 World Series, a team that had not won the World Series for 108 years. Obviously, Theo knew something, and what he was doing was on the right path. Billy Beane and Theo Epstein were at the front of the wave of analytics nerds that were being hired by every major league team out there. Now, I'm not going to talk about analytics, sabermetrics, their value, any of that in this video here. But the important piece is that every single team in Major League Baseball has come to embrace advanced analytics at some point in the last decade or so. Now, whether you agree with advanced metrics or analytics or not is beside the point. The point is that the economics of baseball was changing again because of these advanced metrics. Teams were slowly starting to use them, and big contracts for long years were still being signed for guys like Prince Fielder, Ryan Howard, or Chris Davis, guys that did not age very well, and by the end of their contracts were certainly not worth the money. Even guys like Albert Pujols or Miguel Cabrera, all-time great players that are definitely Hall of Famers, were worth the money the first few years of their contract, but by the last half of their contract, perhaps they weren't. And baseball teams were more able to predict that and judge that before offering a contract. Now, what this new breed of Ivy League general manager figured out is that baseball teams could look at when players provide the most value compared to what they're paid. And what they learned makes a lot of sense. The best value that they get out of players is usually in their first couple of years. Maybe not in their first year or second year unless it's a superstar player, but certainly in years 3 to 6 before they become free agents, when players were not being paid very well yet because they hadn't reached free agency, but they were definitely producing at a high level. And even some of the big free agents in their prime years, 28 to 32 or so, when they were getting paid a lot more, but they were still producing a lot. But certainly the ends of contracts after the age of 35, players were not worth the money that was being thrown at them in the 1980s, 90s, and even 2000s. As a result of this, the older free agents who were looking for their payday that they had waited so long to get weren't getting it anymore. And not only that, the teams started to manipulate the service time of the youngest players. If they could keep these players in the minor leagues a little bit longer, it would allow them to keep control over that player longer into their prime, and they wouldn't be free agents until the age of 29 or 30. They might lose out on free agency altogether if they can't make free agent money at an older age. So now we have caught up to the current state of economics in baseball. Free agency has finally been accepted by the owners as a thing that's gonna stay. Teams have started revenue sharing to be able to level the playing field and keep all the teams competitive when they choose to do so. Young players are being exploited to a degree, causing them to lose out on potentially making free agent money in their prime. And free agents, Well, the best free agents are still getting paid a lot of money, which is great for them because they're the best of the best in the major leagues. But the average or older free agent is not getting paid what they used to be paid. And the problem is that the system is a bit broken. If older free agents aren't really as valuable as they used to be seen as, then the teams should be paying the younger players when they are really valuable more money. That way a player can actually make his salary in his prime when he should be. Many traditional baseball fans will openly gripe about how they wish the game was still being played the way it used to be, the good old days. But this completely ignores the fact that baseball has been a business for 150 years. And only recently have the players been able to enjoy the portion of the revenues that should have been theirs all along. This is a player's livelihood, often their only chance to make really good money if this is what they do for a living. Most players retire by the mid to late 30s anyway, and that's if a major injury doesn't occur that would shorten their career and end it by their early to mid 20s even. I for one am behind the players in this. I think they should be making what they're worth, especially when these billionaire owners keep on raking in profits that the players just want their portion of. To wrap up a lot of these ideas into a nice little package for you, I'm going to share some statistics going back to just before the advent of free agency. The minimum salary, what the base level salary in Major League Baseball, has increased from $6,000 in 1967 to $30,000 in 1980, $100,000 in 1990, $200,000 in 2000, $400,000 in 2010, and $570,000 in 2021. Obviously some really good gains there once free agency was finally instituted. The average Major League salary over that same time period rose from just under $19,000 per season in 1967 to $144,000 in 1980, $600,000 in 1990, $1.9 million in the year 2000, $3 million in 2010, and $4.2 million in 2021. Now remember to put these salaries as well into the context of the value of major league teams that have increased over the same time period. The highest paid player in baseball at the beginning of each decade going back to 1920 was Ty Cobb in 1920 with a $20,000 salary. Babe Ruth in 1930, $80,000. Hank Greenberg 1940, $40,000. Joe DiMaggio 1950, $100,000. Willie Mays 1960, $80,000. Willie Mays 1970, $135,000. Nolan Ryan 1980, $1 million. Robin Yount 1990, $3.2 million. Alex Rodriguez 2001, $22 million. Alex Rodriguez 2010, $33 million. And finally, Mike Trout in 2021, $37.1 million. So we can see again, these numbers were extremely stagnant, going from 1930 at least to 1970, but increased as they should have been all along, leading up to the year 1980 through the early 2000s. If the owners had been paying players what they had been worth prior to 1980, it wouldn't have been such a shock to the system at the time. And I will note here too that between 2010 and 2021, salaries have once again become quite stagnant, especially with the manipulation of service time and the reluctance to give older free agents higher salaries that we discussed previously. Now let's compare these numbers that we just talked about for baseball player salaries to a stat that is the average major league payroll compared to the team's overall total revenues. So what percentage of their revenues is going to their payroll? In 1930, the overall percentage going to payroll began at 35%. In 1940, it was 32%. By 1950, it had dropped all the way to 17%. 1970 was 19%. 1977, right after the start of free agency, was 25%. By 1980, given a couple years to grow, was 39%. 1988, just after the 3 years of collusion, was 34%. 1990, 33%. 1991, it grew to 43%. In 1994, the year of the strike, the percentage of revenue that was going to payroll was up to 60%. By the year 2000, it had dropped down to 54%. By 2010, 53%, and by 2019, it was 50%. In my humble opinion, for 150 years, the owners of Major League Baseball teams have not been able to figure out that the players are the draw. Sure, a lot of fans will root for their teams and the uniforms, and that is true that players may come and go and the fans stay with their teams. But without those players being the draw, there wouldn't be a team on the field worth watching. In the last few decades, the players are finally getting their due, and in exchange, they are typically vilified and labeled as greedy and ungrateful. I, for one, am very grateful that all of these players continue to put on a uniform every day and bust their butt to make sure that they are the best players that they can be, just so that I have a sport and teams that I can continue to root for. And they're the best of the best in an industry that rakes in billions of dollars every single year. In my mind, the players deserve every single penny that they're getting. And over the decades since free agency was instituted, the owners and the teams have gotten a lot smarter about how to evaluate players and how to actually give contracts to guys that will probably be worth the value of that contract in the long run. I did make this video a while ago in the last offseason, and since that time there was a new contract signed between the baseball players and the owners. There were quite a few concessions made, like the raising of the minimum salary and also a bonus pool that was put together for the best players that were not yet eligible for arbitration. This has actually chipped away a little bit at what we talked about earlier, that some of the best players when they're young aren't getting paid the value that they're actually providing to their team. And this is a small step to being able to reform the economics of being a baseball player, getting guys money earlier in their career when they probably deserve it, and later in the career when they're not quite worth the same value, they may not get those contracts anymore. I really appreciate you coming along with me on this journey, and I hope you enjoyed learning a bit more about the history of being paid to play baseball. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, keep talking baseball, and I'll see you next time.